Her son walked in with supermarket flowers, 4 years after disappearing. Helen Montgomery, frail but unshaken, didn't invite him to sit. Gregory Shaw, her lawyer, was already waiting with the papers. The house, the accounts, the heirlooms, every bit now belonged to her nurse. Mark's name had been erased in ink and law, and in minutes he'd learned just how final her goodbye really was. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. 4 years of silence. 4 years to think. Helen Montgomery sat in her armchair by the living room window, her frame small against the deep cushions. Morning light pushed through lace curtains, catching in the dust that swirled whenever a breeze slipped past the old frames. The street outside lay quiet under the slow sway of the oaks, their Spanish moss dangling like tired ribbons. She had lived on this block for nearly 40 years and knew the rhythm of its days, when the mail truck would rumble by, which porch light would flicker on first at dusk. She also knew which doors saw regular visitors. Hers wasn't one of them. A sedan slowed across the street. A middle-aged man stepped out, a girl of maybe 10 bounding from the passenger seat. The man's arms were full of grocery bags. The girl carried a bakery box. They disappeared into the brick bungalow with a knock, a laugh, the sound of welcome. Helen's hands curled over the arms of her chair. That kind of arrival was foreign to her now. Angela Reed entered from the kitchen, soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper on the hardwood. She carried a tray, teacup, lemon wedge, 2 shortbread cookies arranged just so. The bright scent of bergamot lifted into the air. "You're up early," Angela said, setting the tray within reach. Helen nodded toward the window. "The street's lively today." "Holiday weekend," Angela replied, leaning slightly to adjust the throw over Helen's knees. "I can close the curtains if you'd rather not see it." Helen shook her head. "No, I'd rather watch even if the world's not looking back." Angela didn't argue. She had a way of listening that made Helen feel seen without being interrogated. It was one of the reasons Helen trusted her more than most. The shrill ring of the rotary phone startled the quiet. Helen reached for the receiver before Angela could move. "Patricia," she said, knowing the voice before it spoke. "Of course you'd know," Patricia Holt replied. Her voice carried its usual briskness, but underneath was something careful. "Do you hear those church bells? They're off by a minute. They sound the same to me," Helen said. Patricia hesitated, then asked, "Have you heard from him?" Helen's gaze stayed on the sidewalk. "No." "Not a call?" "Not since the card," Helen said. Her voice flat. She remembered it too clearly. A glossy lighthouse on the front, its beam painted in neat gold foil. Inside, "Happy Birthday," Mom in Mark's tidy handwriting. No visit, no phone call, just a stamp and a cancellation mark. Patricia made a low, sharp sound. 4 years, Helen. You've been in that house, needing help, and he has a busy life. Helen interrupted. Busy's the excuse people use when they don't want to make time. He's 3 hours away. People drive farther for good barbecue. Helen's lips twitched. "Don't make me spill my tea, Trish." From the kitchen, the kettle began to click as it cooled. Angela had moved there quietly, leaving them privacy. "I'm coming by this afternoon," Patricia said. "Lemon squares from Harris's, and that puzzle book you never finish." "You're spoiling me." "You deserve spoiling," Patricia replied. Then after a beat, "You've thought about arrangements." Helen shifted in her chair. "I've thought about plenty of things. You know my opinion," Patricia said. 4 years without a visit. Blood isn't loyalty. Helen's eyes drifted toward the kitchen doorway. Angela's silhouette moved through a curl of steam, steady, familiar. "Trish," Helen began. "I mean it," Patricia cut in. "If you're smart, you'll keep him out of your will." The afternoon light had shifted, long stripes of shadow stretching across Helen's living room. Patricia's words still clung to the air like the faint scent of lemon squares from the bakery box on the coffee table. Helen eased herself up from the armchair and shuffled toward the hallway, the polished floor creaking under her slippers. She didn't tell Patricia where she was going. Her fingers found the brass handle of the small oak desk, tucked beneath the stairs. The drawer stuck for a second, then gave way with a reluctant sigh. Inside, under a neat stack of old letters, lay a thick manila envelope. She pulled it free, the weight of it strangely heavier than paper should be. Angela passed through the hall carrying a pitcher of water. "Need a hand?" she asked. "I've got it," Helen said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that discouraged questions. Back in the living room, she slid the papers from the envelope. The first page bore the neat header of Gregory Shaw's law office, dated almost a decade earlier. Her eyes scanned the familiar lines. Her name, her address, the list of possessions, and then the line that still pinched. Mark Montgomery, sole beneficiary. Her son's name sat there in black ink, unmoving, permanent-looking, but she knew better. Paper was patient. When she called Gregory's office, his assistant put her through almost immediately. His voice was the same, low, measured, each word considered. "Helen, good to hear from you," Gregory said. "I need to discuss my will," she replied, fingers smoothing the edge of the page. "That can be amended at any time," he said without hesitation. "It's your estate, Helen, your decision." She didn't speak for a moment, listening to the muted hum of the line. Somewhere in the kitchen, a glass touched the counter. Angela was refilling it. She didn't come in, didn't intrude, but Helen could feel her presence like the steady hum of a heartbeat. "I'm considering someone else," Helen said finally. "I can arrange a meeting," Gregory replied. No need for Mark to be involved. The faintest relief slipped into her chest. "Good." Angela appeared in the doorway then, carrying the refreshed glass. The ice clinked gently as she set it down. "Water's here, anything else?" Her voice held no tremor now. Patricia's eyes brightened. "You've decided?" Helen looked down at the will one last time. The ink declaring Mark as her sole heir. "No, no, thank you," Helen said. Angela nodded once, and without glancing at the spread of legal papers on the coffee table, returned to the kitchen. Patricia arrived not long after, carrying a tote bag and the sharp energy of someone with an opinion to share. She spotted the papers immediately. "So you're finally looking at that?" she asked, setting her bag down with a soft thud. "I am," Helen said. Patricia lowered herself into the armchair opposite. "You know where I stand. Loyalty over blood, every time." Helen's eyes moved from the will to the doorway where Angela had vanished a moment earlier. She thought of every morning tea, every steady hand guiding hers to the railing, every silence that was never cold. "She's here," Patricia continued. "He isn't. That's the only math you need." The clock on the mantel ticked softly, each second pressing the air thinner. Helen reached for the phone again. "Gregory," she said when he answered, "let's set that appointment." Soon longer looked permanent at all. It looked like a placeholder, waiting to be replaced. She leaned toward Patricia, her voice no louder than a breath. "I know exactly who deserves it." The first sound Helen heard that morning was the click of the front door, soft but certain, followed by the scent of rain-soaked air drifting in from the porch. She'd barely slept, her chest had felt tight through the night, and every shift in the bed brought a low throb in her side. Yet by the time Angela stepped into the bedroom doorway, she carried the calm brightness of someone who could make the day feel lighter just by walking in. "Morning, Helen," Angela said, holding up a small glass jar filled with daffodils. Rainwater still clung to their petals, catching in fresh from Mrs. Porter's yard. "She said you used to compliment them every spring." Helen smiled faintly. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "I notice," Angela said simply. She placed the jar on the kitchen table where sunlight touched the blooms, then returned to Helen with the same sure steps. "Let's get your meds before breakfast." Helen sat at the edge of the bed, while Angela laid out the pills on a small porcelain dish. The bitterness of one tablet clung to her tongue, but Angela followed it with a glass of water so cold it made her teeth ache pleasantly. There was no rush, no impatient glances at a watch. Angela always moved at Helen's pace, not her own. They moved to the kitchen together, Helen leaning on Angela's arm for balance. The air smelled faintly of toast and brewed coffee. Angela slid bread into the toaster, then cracked eggs into a skillet, the soft sizzle filling the space. You read anything last night? Angela asked, glancing over her shoulder. Couldn't focus, Helen admitted. My eyes felt heavy. Angela nodded. I brought you something then. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn paperback, its cover a watercolor of a lighthouse on a stormy coast. One of my favorites. Short chapters, easy to pick up and put down. Helen chuckled softly. A lighthouse again. Seems to be a theme lately. Angela poured tea, the scent of bergamot curling in the air. Maybe this one will bring better luck than the last. They ate at the table, the daffodils between them. Conversation shifted easily, from the stubborn oak tree roots lifting the sidewalk out front, to a neighbor's cat that had taken to napping in Helen's garden. By the time the plates were cleared, Helen realized her chest felt lighter, her body warmer. A knock sounded at the door. Angela opened it to reveal Patricia, cheeks pink from the morning chill, a crossword puzzle book tucked under her arm. You look better than yesterday, Patricia said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She dropped the puzzle book on the table and eyed the flowers. Ah, the daffodils. I was wondering who stole them out from under Mrs. Porter's nose. I rescued them, Angela replied with a grin. Patricia smirked. You and your rescues. She turned back to Helen, ready to lose at another crossword. They settled into the living room, Helen in her armchair, Patricia on the sofa, Angela perched on the morning passed with the soft scratch of pencil, bursts of laughter when Patricia stubbornly insisted her wrong answers were right, and the clink of teacups returning to saucers. In that warm, easy bubble, Helen realized how different she felt in their company, less like a patient, more like herself. Around Mark, in the rare moments he had been there, she'd always felt a stiffness, a silent accounting in his eyes, as though her worth could be tallied in assets and inconveniences. Around Angela, there was no ledger, just presence. You're smiling, Patricia said suddenly, her pencil pausing mid-letter. Am I? Helen asked. Big as the Savannah River, Patricia replied. I'll take credit for it. Not this time, Helen said, her gaze flicking toward Angela. This one's hers. Angela didn't look up from her tea, but her hand stilled on the handle. The phone rang, its sound sharp against the gentle hum of conversation. Angela rose to answer, but Helen lifted a hand. I'll get it. She picked up the receiver, her voice clear. Hello, Helen. It's Gregory, came the familiar measured tone. I'm ready to meet about the will changes. When can you come in? Helen's eyes met Angela's across the room. Soon, she said. Very soon. The sky was the dull gray of old pewter as Angela helped Helen into the passenger seat. The chill in the Savannah air made Helen's breath puff faintly, and she pulled her coat tighter. The car smelled faintly of lavender from the sachet. Angela kept clipped to the vent, a small attempt to make every trip feel less like an errand, and more like care. You sure you're up for this today? Angela asked, adjusting the seatbelt gently over Helen's shoulder. I've been up for this for 4 years, Helen replied, her voice steady. Angela didn't ask more. She just started the engine, the heater sighing to life, and steered them onto the oak-lined streets. The moss swayed overhead, and now and then a breeze sent leaves scuttling across the pavement like startled mice. Gregory Shaw's office sat in a converted Victorian near the river, its brick facade softened by ivy and the scent of rain lingering from the night before. Inside, the air was warm, smelling faintly of polished wood and old paper. The receptionist smiled and ushered them into Gregory's office, where Patricia was already seated by the window, her crossword book peeking from her tote. You look ready for battle, Patricia said with a half-smile as Helen entered. Not battle, Helen said, lowering herself into the chair Gregory pulled out for her. Just clarity. Gregory, tall and spare in a charcoal suit, closed the door behind them. We'll take this step by step, he said, his tone as calm as the lined notepad in front of him. You've asked to make significant changes. Helen glanced at Angela, who was standing quietly beside her chair, hands clasped in front of her. Yes, Helen said. Angela is to be my primary beneficiary. Effective immediately. Patricia's head turned slightly toward Angela, catching the flicker of surprise in her face. Gregory's pen moved steadily over the page. And Mark? Helen's answer came without hesitation. Remove him entirely. The room stilled for a moment. Rain tapped lightly against the tall window. Angela shifted, as if to speak, but stopped herself. This is your decision alone, Helen, Gregory said. I just need to confirm you understand the legal implications. I do, Helen replied. More than anyone in this room knows. Patricia reached over and laid her palm over Helen's hand, a brief pressure that spoke of approval rather than pity. Gregory slid the draft amendment across the desk. Helen adjusted her glasses and read each line, the black ink crisp against the cream paper. There was no mention of Mark now, no trace of the man who had stayed away for 4 years. In his place was Angela's name, repeated in neat legal phrasing. Patricia signed as witness, her signature looping with deliberate flourish. Gregory added his own before passing the pen to Helen. Her hand trembled only slightly as she pressed the nib to paper and wrote her name, each letter a quiet declaration. When it was done, Gregory gathered the pages and slid them into a folder. The sound of the metal clasp clicking shut felt final. He placed the folder into a thick envelope and sealed it with a firm press of his palm. That's it? Helen asked. That's it for the will, Gregory confirmed. The document is now legally binding. These copies go into my files, and one will be delivered to you. Helen leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Angela's eyes met hers, wide, unsure, grateful in a way that seemed to catch her off guard. I don't know what to say, Angela murmured. You don't have to say anything, Helen said. Just keep showing up like you always have. Gregory set the sealed envelope aside, folding his hands on the desk. His gaze held steady on Helen. If you want, he said slowly, we can secure it in a trust too. 2 days after the will change, Helen sat across from Gregory again, this time in a smaller meeting room at the back of his office. Outside, the rain had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean, but inside the scent of polished oak and fresh coffee lingered. Angela stood just behind Helen's chair, her presence steady, while Patricia sat to the side with her tote, watching with an expression somewhere between satisfaction and vigilance. This, Gregory said, sliding a new set of documents across the table, is the living trust agreement. It will transfer ownership of your home, your accounts, and any personal property to the trust during your lifetime. Upon your passing, everything will go directly to your chosen trustee and beneficiary, without probate. Helen glanced down at the neatly printed pages. The name Angela Reed appeared in all the right places. Trustee, sole beneficiary. Successor owner. The words had a finality to them, but also a comfort. Once I sign, Helen asked. It's binding. Completely, Gregory confirmed. And much harder to contest than a simple will. Helen took the pen he offered, its weight cool in her hand. She began signing where his fingers indicated, the ink flowing across the page in deliberate strokes. She didn't look at Angela as she wrote, didn't want the younger woman to see the moisture gathering in her eyes. When the last page was signed, Gregory gathered the stack, slid it into a thick folder, and sealed it in an envelope marked record copy. I'll file this with the county clerk this afternoon, he said. By tonight the transfer will be official. Patricia's lips curved. And just like that, you've shut the door on any arguments. Helen allowed herself a slow breath, the kind that feels earned. Doors need shutting sometimes. They left Gregory's office together, the winter sun pale but bright overhead. Patricia looped her arm through Helen's. You know what we need now? Lunch. Somewhere with pie. Helen smiled. You're speaking my language. They ended up at Clary's Cafe, tucked into a corner booth that smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. The clink of silverware and low hum of conversation wrapped around them. You sold. What the Hospice was Helen. Angela excused herself to take a call outside, leaving Patricia and Helen with their menus. You really did it, Patricia said, leaning forward. He can't touch a thing now. Helen stirred her tea slowly, watching the swirl of amber. It's not about keeping him from things, it's about giving them to the right person. Patricia nodded. Still, it's nice when those two goals line up. Angela returned just as the waitress set down their food. Patricia's chicken salad sandwich, Helen's bowl of tomato soup with a side of cornbread. For a while they just ate, the comfort of the cafe, making the weight of the morning feel a little less sharp. Back home that afternoon, Helen settled into her chair by the window, the daffodils still bright on the kitchen table in the background. Angela was upstairs gathering laundry when the phone rang. Helen reached for the receiver. "Hi, Mom." The voice startled her, not because she didn't recognize it, but because it had been so long since she'd heard it through anything but voicemail. Mark's tone carried that practiced casualness, as if no time had passed. "I heard you've been under the weather," he said. Helen's fingers tightened slightly on the cord. "I've had some health issues, yes." "Well," Mark said, "I wanted to check in, see how you were doing." Her eyes drifted toward the stairs, where Angela's footsteps were faint overhead. "I'm managing." "That's good." There was a pause, then a faint chuckle. "I guess I should come visit one of these days." She said nothing to fill the silence. "Maybe." Mark's voice sharpened slightly, as if choosing the right phrasing. "Next month." The words didn't leave Helen's mouth, but they pulsed through her thoughts as Angela's fingers moved over the phone screen with controlled speed. The muffled voice of the 911 operator came through, met by Angela's crisp, efficient answers: address, symptoms, age, oxygen levels. "Help is on the way, Helen," Angela murmured, already shifting the concentrator dial higher and adjusting the tubing over Helen's ears. The plastic felt cool against skin damp with sweat. The siren reached them before the red and blue lights. It cut through the stillness of the quiet street, bouncing off the houses and growing louder until the ambulance stopped at the curb. The air outside carried the faint metallic tang of oncoming rain. Two paramedics swept in, their boots squeaking on the polished floor. One took Helen's vitals while the other secured her onto the stretcher. She caught Angela's face above her, steady but intent, the kind of look that didn't allow space for fear to take root. Angela climbed into the ambulance beside her, without waiting for permission. The back doors shut with a thud, sealing them into the hum of medical equipment and the faint antiseptic scent of the stretcher. "You're going to be fine," Angela said, her hand finding Helen's and holding it firmly through each jolt as the vehicle lurched forward. Helen could feel the rhythm of Angela's breathing, slower and deeper than her own, as if lending her the pattern she'd lost. At Memorial Health University Medical Center, the ER lights were too bright, bleaching the edges of everything. Voices overlapped, a nurse calling for a chart, the beeping of a monitor, the hiss of oxygen. Angela stayed at Helen's side through the intake, answering questions before Helen had to muster the breath. Hours blurred. There were moments of cold, a stethoscope pressed against her back, the swipe of an alcohol pad before an IV, and moments of sound, like the steady murmur of Angela's voice reading off medication dosages to a nurse. By the time they moved Helen to a quieter room upstairs, midnight had long passed. Angela refused the offered cot, unfolding herself into the chair beside the bed instead. She pulled her cardigan tighter and sat forward, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed on Helen's breathing as if it were the most important clock in the world. At some point before dawn, the door eased open. Patricia slipped in, carrying a tote bag. "Essentials," she whispered. "Robe, slippers, your crossword book, and some lemon drops." Helen managed a tired smile. "You always know." Gregory stood, tucking the folder under his arm. "I'll have the amendments filed by tomorrow." "It's done, Helen. Solid as bedrock." Patricia reached for her coat. "Then I say we all deserve a nap." The rest of the day passed in a gentle rhythm, nurses checking vitals, Patricia fussing over blanket corners, Angela adjusting Helen's pillows. Outside the window, the sky shifted from afternoon gold to the violet edge of evening. Helen drifted in and out of light sleep, the oxygen's soft whisper lulling her. The weight of the signed papers was gone from her hands but not from her mind. It stayed with her like a secret she could finally stop guarding so tightly. Near dusk, The hospital phone on the side table blinked with a new voicemail notification. Angela checked the display. "It's your home line," she said, handing it over. Helen pressed the button and held the receiver to her ear. "Hey, Mom." Mark's voice came too casual, too light. "Just wanted to let you know I'll be in town soon. Maybe we can catch up." He showed up too late for the important part. The knock at the door was unfamiliar. Too loud for Patricia's polite double tap, too erratic for the quiet rhythm of the hospice nurse. Helen felt it in her chest before she heard Angela's footsteps cross the foyer. When the door swung open, there he was. Mark filled the threshold in a crisp navy polo, sunglasses perched on his head like a crown. His smile was quick, practiced, almost reflexive. In his hand, a cellophane-wrapped bouquet of mixed flowers sagged under its own plastic weight. A bright orange sticker near the stems read "Manager's Special, $4.99. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. "Long time, huh?" Helen sat in her armchair, the oxygen tubing draped over her shoulders, the blanket smoothed across her knees. 4 years, she said evenly. Angela appeared at his side, taking the flowers before he could awkwardly set them down. "I'll put these in water," she murmured, disappearing into the kitchen with the faint crinkle of plastic. Mark dropped onto the couch, leaning back as though he owned the space. "Traffic was brutal," he started, gesturing broadly. "Between the construction and some idiot in a pickup swerving all over, I thought I'd never get here." Helen let him talk. His voice filled the room, describing near misses on the highway, the cost of gas, how his neighbor's new boat trailer blocked the street. She nodded once or twice, though her eyes stayed on him in that long level way that made silence into its own kind of question. Angela returned with the bouquet in a clear vase, the water clouded slightly from the stems. She set it on the side table beside Helen's chair. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked Mark. "Nah," he said, glancing briefly at her. "Maybe give us a little space, just for a bit?" Angela's eyes flicked to Helen. Helen gave the smallest nod. Without another word, Angela stepped back into the kitchen. The hum of running water followed. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So you've been through some stuff, huh? Guess I should have made it here sooner, but you know how life gets. The kids' schedules, work deadlines, trying to keep everything together." Helen's voice stayed calm. "Life slows down for some of us." He gave a quick laugh, as if brushing past the comment. "Anyway, I figured we should maybe talk about arrangements. Just so I know what's what. For when the time comes." The phrase hung in air like an off note. "Arrangements," she repeated. "Yeah, you know, the house, the accounts, your stuff. I'm not trying to be morbid, but someone's got to make sure it all gets handled. I could take some of that off your plate." She didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, a wind rattled the live oak branches. From the kitchen came the soft clink of a spoon against a mug. Mark tried again, lowering his voice as though he were speaking confidentially. "I just want to be prepared. You can trust me with this." Her gaze stayed steady, unblinking. She thought of the folder in Gregory's office, her signature on every page, Angela's name written where his used to be. The legal walls she had built were already standing, and he was on the other side. He leaned back, spreading his arms over the couch. "We could even start going through things now if you want. Clear out some of the old stuff, decide what's worth keeping. That way it's easier later." Helen studied him. His words carried the smoothness of someone talking about efficiency, but his eyes flickered to the antique clock on the mantel, the framed photographs on the shelves. "Inventorying. You've been busy," she said, finally. "Yeah," he said, seizing on the word "busy's good. But I made time to be here now." She let a thin, almost smile touch her lips. It wasn't amusement, more like a verdict she'd already reached. "Don't worry, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "It's all taken care of." Mark glanced at his watch for the third time in less than 20 minutes. He sat slouched on the couch, one arm draped over the back, as if the living room were just a pit stop on his way somewhere more important. Helen, propped in her armchair with the oxygen hissing faintly beside her, kept her hands folded in her lap. His gaze wandered to the mantel clock, the bookshelf, the framed photograph of him as a boy holding a fishing rod with his father. But it never lingered on her for long. "Well," he said, rising, "I should get going. The kids have a soccer game this afternoon, and I promised I'd be there." "That's nice," Helen replied, the politeness in her tone polished but hollow. He bent for a quick hug. It was brief, light, and left only the sharp, unfamiliar scent of his cologne in the air. "I'll call," he said. Helen gave a small nod. The door closed behind him with a muted click that felt more like a period than a comma. From the kitchen came the faint sound of running water, then Angela's quiet footsteps. She entered carrying a tray with fresh tea, the citrus-bright scent of lemon drifting ahead of her. "All set for your tea, Helen? You always seem to know when I need it most," Helen said. Angela poured carefully, the steam curling between them, and slid the cup toward her. She didn't ask how the visit went. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more understanding than questions ever could. Not long after, Patricia arrived with her usual brisk knock. She stepped inside, her eyes going straight to the bouquet on the side table. "Well, look at that. Grocery store special." Helen allowed herself a small chuckle.
You don't miss a thing.
Patricia's gaze shifted to the blanket tucked neatly around Helen's legs. "I take it Angela was stationed nearby, ready to reclaim her post?" Angela gave a wry smile. "Not exactly, but I wasn't far." They all sat for a while, Patricia sipping tea while tossing in neighborhood gossip, Angela occasionally adding a dry comment that made Helen laugh. Yet under the light chatter, Helen could feel the quiet truth. Mark's brief drop-in had been a gesture, not a visit. The difference between showing up and being present had never been clearer. When Patricia left, Angela helped Helen into the sunroom. The glass panes framed the pale winter light, and the wool blanket felt heavy and comforting across her lap. Angela brought the Lighthouse novel from the side table and settled into the armchair across from her. "Ready for another chapter?" Angela asked. Helen adjusted the oxygen tube. "Go on then." Angela's voice filled the room in a steady rhythm, her tone rich and unhurried. The story's coastal setting seemed to breathe into the space, the imagined salt wind mixing with the faint lemon from Helen's tea, the creak of the old house answering the creak of the fictional lighthouse stairs. Helen let her eyes close, not from exhaustion, but from the rare peace of being cared for without conditions. She thought of signatures on crisp legal paper, of doors quietly but decisively closed. No guilt came with the thought, only the deep certainty that she had chosen rightly. The knock at the front door came soft but deliberate. Angela set the book aside and went to answer. Her voice greeted someone, and a moment later the doctor stepped in, unbuttoning his coat. "Good afternoon, Helen," he said, moving toward her. His tone carried the practiced warmth of someone about to deliver unwelcome news. "I've been reviewing your latest results and the notes from your hospital stay." He took the seat across from her, folding his hands. "I think it's time we start discussing hospice care." 3 days after the doctor's visit, Helen was back in her own home. The hospital smell still clung faintly to her robe, but the familiar creak of the front steps under the gurney wheels felt like an exhale she'd been holding for weeks. The hospice nurse moved quietly through the rooms, checking oxygen lines and adjusting the hospital bed now set up in the sunroom so she could watch the oaks sway outside. Angela was there before the nurse left, her bag slung over one shoulder. "I've already cleared my schedule," she told Helen, pulling the throw blanket over her legs. "The other clients are covered. You've got me full-time." Helen tried to protest, a half-hearted "you don't have to," but Angela only shook her head. "I want to." Patricia took up the errands without discussion. The fridge never stayed empty. The mailbox was cleared each afternoon, and every few days she brought a paper bag of lemon squares or fresh bread, setting them on the counter with a cheerful try not to eat them all at once. The days began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Angela managed medications with the precision of a watchmaker, her notes lined neatly in the binder by the bed. Mornings carried the faint aroma of coffee and cinnamon toast. In the afternoons, the sun angled through the glass, catching the dust in lazy spirals, while Angela read aloud or simply sat with her, their silences companionable rather than heavy. On the second week home, Helen's phone buzzed on the side table. Angela, seated nearby, glanced at the screen before handing it over. Mark, the name she hadn't seen light up the phone since his visit. The message was short. "How's everything?" Helen read it twice, her thumb hovering over the screen. Without a word, she pressed delete. The absence of a reply felt lighter than any answer she might have given. Angela said nothing, just adjusted the blanket around Helen's shoulders and returned to her book. Patricia noticed the next day while unpacking groceries. "Haven't heard from him?" she asked, setting a carton of milk in the fridge. "He texted," Helen replied, voice flat. "And I didn't answer." Patricia closed the fridge door with a decisive click. "Good." The following days were marked by small, steady comforts. The hospice team came and went with gentle efficiency, replacing oxygen tanks, checking vitals, leaving behind a soft scent of hand sanitizer. Angela learned their first names and made sure Helen never felt like a patient on a checklist. Sometimes at night, Helen lay awake listening to the faint hum of the oxygen machine, the sound of Angela moving quietly in the kitchen or patting down the hall to check on her. It was a different kind of security than she'd felt in years, not the illusion that someone might come through the door, but the certainty that someone already had, and stayed. One morning, rain tapped the glass in a slow, steady rhythm. Angela brewed tea, the citrus steam mingling with the smell of rain-soaked earth drifting in through the cracked window. "You like this weather," Angela said, setting the cup in Helen's hands. "It makes the world feel smaller," Helen replied. "Easier to hold on to." They sat listening to the rain, the sound wrapping around the house like a blanket. That evening, Patricia dropped by with a bag of peaches from the market. "They're early this year," she said, slicing one for Helen. The sweet scent filled the room, warm and summery despite the damp air outside. After she left, Helen drifted into a light sleep, waking only when the phone rang. Angela answered, her voice calm and even, then turned to Helen with the receiver. "It's Gregory," she said. Helen took the call. Gregory's voice was low, measured. "I just wanted to confirm, Helen, all the trust execution steps are ready to proceed after your passing. Everything is in place exactly as you wanted." By the third week of hospice care, Helen's breathing had slowed to a shallow tide. Each inhale was a small victory, each exhale a soft surrender. The sunroom, once her place to watch the street and the changing light, had transformed into a quiet cocoon. The curtains were drawn halfway to keep the glare out, and the scent of fresh lilies from Patricia's last visit hung in the air, sweet and faintly sharp. Angela sat beside her bed, her chair pulled so close their elbows could almost touch. She'd been there all day and the night before, leaving only to make tea or fetch medication. Her cardigan hung loose over her shoulders, and a small crease between her brows hinted at the weight of her vigil. Patricia arrived mid-morning, her coat dusted with fine drizzle. She shook it off in the hallway, and stepped in carrying a worn hardcover book. "Thought I'd try this," she said, holding it up. "Remember when we read it together in high school?" Helen's lips curved faintly. "You read." "I took notes." Patricia perched on the edge of the armchair opposite Angela, flipping to the first chapter. Her voice was softer than usual, each word paced to match the rhythm of Helen's breaths. The story wound around the three of them, filling the pauses between the oxygen's whisper and the occasional creak of the old house. Hours passed in gentle cycles, a sip of water here, a shift of pillows there, the occasional murmur of thanks from Helen. Her voice had grown quieter, almost a thread, but each word landed with intention. That afternoon, she reached for Angela's hand. "You've given me more than anyone else in these years," she said, her thumb brushing weakly over Angela's knuckles. "Not just care, presence." Angela swallowed, her voice catching before she could answer. "You've given me just as much, Helen, more than you realize." Patricia leaned forward, covering Helen's other hand. "You'll never know how much you've been loved." Helen's eyes closed briefly, as if she were trying to hold those words inside her. The rain outside deepened, pattering against the glass in a steady percussion. A neighbor's wind chime shivered in the breeze, its thin notes weaving into the room. Somewhere down the hall, the clock chimed once for the half hour. Mark never came. There had been no calls, no messages since his last text weeks ago. Helen had stopped expecting the sound of his voice. It was easier to let the quiet stand than to hope for something that wouldn't arrive. By early evening, the room had grown dim. Angela turned on the lamp beside the bed, the amber light casting soft shadows against the walls. Patricia closed the book but kept her place with a ribbon, her voice low as she told some trivial neighborhood story: a cat that kept slipping into the bakery, a teenager who'd painted his bike gold. Helen drifted in and out of sleep, waking briefly to the warmth of a blanket being adjusted, or the cool touch of a cloth on her forehead. She no longer tried to track the hours. Time was marked by changes in light and the gentle shift of voices around her. At one point, her eyes opened to see Angela leaning forward, her face lit by the lamplight. Every detail, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the silver glint in her dark hair, sharpened in Helen's fading focus. She took a slow breath, the effort visible in the rise of her chest. Her lips moved first without sound, then a whisper broke through. "It's yours now." Angela's brows drew together. "What is?" Helen's gaze stayed fixed on her, a faint but certain smile touching her mouth. "All of it." The morning Helen died began with stillness, not the ordinary quiet of her home, but the kind that felt as if even the air was holding its breath. Outside, the moss-draped oaks stood motionless, their branches etched in the pale light. Angela had been dozing in the chair beside the bed, the lighthouse novel resting closed on her lap, when she sensed it. She reached for Helen's hand, cool now, fingers slack, and knew. No labored breath, no soft wheeze from the oxygen tube, just the gentle release that came when the body finally stopped asking for more time. She sat there for a long moment, thumb brushing over knuckles that no longer tightened back. Then she reached for the phone and dialed Patricia. "She's gone," Angela said simply when Patricia answered. Patricia's breath caught audibly, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm coming over." By the time Patricia arrived, the hospice nurse had been and gone, leaving the room in order, the blankets smoothed, the oxygen machine silent in the corner. Patricia went straight to Helen, laying her hand on the older woman's arm. "You did it your way," she murmured. Angela busied herself in the kitchen, setting out mugs and a pot of coffee, neither of them rigibonmuted, but both needed to hold. A knock came at the door. Familiar. Gregory Shaw stood there, a leather folder tucked under his arm, his coat collar turned up against the morning chill. His face was solemn but purposeful. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said to Angela as he stepped inside. Helen made it clear she wanted everything set in motion right away. "If you're ready, I can begin the trust proceedings." Angela nodded, leading him into the living room. Patricia followed, her gaze never far from the sunroom doorway. Gregory laid out the documents on the coffee table, explaining each step in that calm, precise way of his. "The trust activates immediately," he said. "This ensures her wishes are carried out without delay or contest." It was mid-discussion when the phone rang again. Not the landline, but Angela's cell. She glanced at the caller ID, her expression tightening slightly. "It's Helen's niece," she said, stepping into the hall to answer. When she returned, her voice was clipped. "She told Mark." Patricia's eyebrows lifted. And he's on his way." Less than an hour later, the sound of tires crunching on the driveway broke the stillness. Angela rose and opened the door before he could knock. Mark stood there in a charcoal windbreaker, hair slightly windblown, as if he'd driven fast. His expression was carefully arranged. Just enough grief to be seen, not enough to feel. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. "Come in," Angela replied, her tone polite, even neutral. He stepped into the living room, eyes sweeping the space, pausing briefly on the closed door to the sunroom. "I wish I'd been here," he said, more to the air than to anyone in particular. Gregory glanced up from the coffee table. "Mark," he said, with a nod. I'm sorry for your loss. We were just finalizing the legal transitions Helen put in place. Mark's gaze sharpened. Transitions? Yes, Gregory said, unruffled. Your mother updated her will and living trust in recent months. She wanted it read in the presence of the primary parties, so I think now is the time. Patricia shifted slightly in her seat, her hands folded, eyes fixed on Mark. Gregory opened the folder, sliding a single page to the top. His voice carried clearly, each word deliberate. I, Helen Montgomery, being of sound mind, do hereby leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to my residence, personal possessions, and financial accounts, to Angela Reed. The name landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Mark blinked, a half-smile twitching at the corner of his mouth as if he'd misheard. I'm sorry, to who? To Angela Reed, Gregory repeated. Your mother named her sole trustee and beneficiary. Patricia's eyes stayed on him unblinking. Angela's hands rested in her lap, her face composed but pale. Mark's expression shifted, disbelief first, then something sharper. That's impossible. I'm her son. Gregory met his gaze evenly. It's not impossible, Mark. It's legally binding. And it's exactly what she wanted. The silence after Gregory's announcement was sharp enough to hear the faint creak of the mantel clock settling. Mark stared at him as though the words might reshuffle themselves if he waited long enough. This is some kind of mistake, Mark said, a brittle laugh breaking under his voice. You're reading it wrong. My mother wouldn't. She would. Patricia cut in, her tone flat as slate. Gregory kept his gaze on Mark. This is the updated will and trust, signed, witnessed, and notarized. Angela Reed is the sole beneficiary and trustee. It is airtight. Mark's face flushed. Airtight? You think a piece of paper is going to erase 48 years of being her son? Gregory's voice remained level, but there was steel in it. This isn't about erasing anything, it's about honoring her wishes. She made them clear, repeatedly, in my presence and in writing. There's no legal ground to contest it. Angela sat still in the armchair opposite Mark, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm but not cold. She looked at him once, met his eyes, then lowered her gaze again. There was nothing to argue. The decision hadn't been hers to make. Mark's voice rose. You expect me to believe she just handed over everything to a nurse? Someone who... He stopped short, catching the flicker in Angela's eyes, and the stiffening in Patricia's shoulders. Patricia leaned back, crossing her arms. Someone who was here when you weren't. Mark turned on her. You've always been against me. I've always been for Helen, Patricia replied, unblinking. The air in the room thickened, heavy with words no one was willing to say aloud. Outside, a breeze caught the chimes on the porch, their thin notes a strange counterpoint to the tension inside. Gregory slid the folder shut and set it squarely on the coffee table. Helen knew there could be tension over this. That's why she created a living trust, transferred all property into it during her lifetime, and removed probate from the equation entirely. Legally, there is no challenge to make. Everything is already under Angela's control. Mark's jaw worked, as if searching for a place to sink his anger. She must have been manipulated. Angela lifted her head, her voice quiet but clear. Your mother wasn't the type to be pushed into anything she didn't want. Mark's hands clenched at his sides. He looked at Gregory, then Patricia, then finally at Angela, his expression twisting between disbelief and resentment. I drove all the way here for this. You drove here for her, Patricia corrected. Or you should have. For a moment it seemed like Mark might speak again, but instead he turned toward the door. The sound of it opening and closing was abrupt, followed by the crunch of his shoes on the gravel drive, until even that faded. The room exhaled. Gregory gathered the documents into his briefcase, the metallic snap of the lock echoing in the quiet. Patricia stood and walked to the window, watching Mark's car back out into the street. Well, she said finally, he got the answer he came for. Angela rose, smoothing the front of her cardigan. I didn't want this to be ugly. Patricia glanced at her. You didn't make it ugly, you just happened to be standing where the truth landed. Angela's eyes drifted to the sunroom doorway, to the bed that still held the faint impression of Helen's shape. The lilies Patricia had brought earlier in the week were beginning to open fully, their scent growing stronger in the warm air. She turned back to Gregory. "There's something I want to do with part of it," she said quietly. Gregory paused. "Go on." "I'd like to create something in her name," Angela said. "Something that will outlast all of us." 2 months after the will was read, the sun rose over Savannah with a golden warmth that promised spring. Angela stood outside the newly renovated wing of the downtown public library, hands clasped in front of her. The brick exterior gleamed, the mortar still clean from construction, and the scent of fresh paint mixed with the faint perfume of camellias blooming along the sidewalk. It had taken weeks of planning, meetings, and signatures, but Helen's gift was now visible in brick and glass, the Helen Montgomery Reading Room. Funded entirely from the inheritance, it wasn't just a room with books, it was a sanctuary designed to be a place of stillness, light, and learning, the way Helen had described libraries in the small stories she used to tell on quiet afternoons. Patricia arrived early, her hair perfectly set, a smile pulling at her lips despite the redness around her eyes. "She would have loved this," she said, stepping beside Angela. Angela glanced toward the double glass doors, where sunlight spilled into the foyer. "I hope so. I wanted it to feel like her, calm, welcoming, a little old-fashioned but with a sense of purpose." Inside, the space was already filling with guests, city officials, library staff, neighbors. The scent of polished oak bookshelves mixed with the crisp smell of new carpet, and the gentle hum of conversation echoed off the high ceiling. A brass plaque had been mounted by the entrance, "The Helen Montgomery Reading Room," in memory of a woman who believed in the quiet power of books and the louder power of kindness. Patricia read the inscription aloud under her breath, her hand brushing the cool metal. "Perfect," she murmured. The mayor arrived shortly after, a tall man in a navy suit whose handshake was warm and deliberate. "Angela," he asked. "On behalf of the city, thank you. This is more than a donation, it's a legacy." Angela smiled politely. It was hers before it was mine. When the time came for speeches, the mayor stood at the small podium near the entrance, the microphone catching the low murmur of the crowd before settling into his voice. "Today we dedicate a space not just for reading, but for reflection. A space born from the generosity of one woman, carried forward by another. Helen Montgomery was a daughter of Savannah, a librarian, and someone who understood that stories can change lives. Thanks to Angela Reed, her commitment to community will continue to do just that." The applause that followed was warm and sustained. Angela stepped forward when the mayor gestured to her, the weight of eyes on her both humbling and strange. She hadn't prepared notes. She spoke from the memory that had been with her since the day Helen first told her over tea about her years at the library. "She once told me," Angela began, "that a library isn't just a building, it's a promise, that knowledge and safety and the simple joy of sitting with a good book should be there for anyone who needs it." She believed in loyalty, in showing up, in being present. This room is for her and for everyone who still believes in those things. The second round of applause was quieter but more intimate, rippling through the room like the hush that falls just before a page turns. Patricia joined Angela for the ribbon cutting. The ceremonial scissors were heavier than they looked, the metal cool in Angela's hands. Together they cut through the deep red ribbon, the snap of it clean and final. The crowd began to drift in, exploring the new shelves, running fingers along the spines of books, pausing at the big windows where sunlight poured in like a benediction. Angela stayed near the doorway, letting others have the first moments with the space. She watched a little boy curl up in one of the armchairs with a picture book, his feet not yet reaching the floor. She saw an older woman run her hand along the plaque, reading the words twice before stepping inside. The air in the room was warm, touched by the smell of paper and polished wood, the murmur of voices low and contented. Angela stepped forward at last, moving to the center of the room where the sunlight spilled directly across the rug. She tilted her head toward the light, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered so quietly only she could hear, "Thank you, Helen." The words hung in the air like a promise kept. Some families are chosen, and they never leave your side.